A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, things are currently, you might even say, looking pretty quiet on terms of the political front in the state of Western Australia. But those things that are looming are very significant in other states. Always good to be able to welcome Peter Abetz, who's the WA State Director for the Australian Christian Lobby. Hey, Peter, welcome back to 2020.
It's good to be with you, Neil, and good morning to afternoon to your listeners, wherever you are.
I think it's all, well, let's just say it's good morning, I think, everywhere right now still in Australia. Hey, proposed changes to the Equal Opportunity Act. This is something that not only is bubbling along in Western Australia, but there are issues and similarities to so much other reform and legislation that are being considered by other states. What's the latest of what's going on in WA, Peter?
Yeah, look, the Equal Opportunity Act was reviewed by the Law Reform Commission, and back in November 2022, the Attorney General announced that the government had, to use his term, broadly accepted the recommendations of the Law Reform Commission, and a lot of it was pretty mundane changes, but there were some that were of great concern, and they're very similar actually to the changes that the Federal or Commonwealth Law Reform Commission was making regarding faith-based schools and wanting to limit the right of faith-based schools to give preference to people of faith in employment, and also that if a teacher no longer conforms to the would you expect the values of the faith of that school, that the school would not be able to terminate their services, and of course that's a real concern. So we've had some meetings with relevant ministers here over time, but it would appear now that the state government is actually going to hold off making any legislative changes until the federal government has actually decide what they're going to do. So it looks like this year there won't be anything happening on the Equal Opportunity Act in Western Australia. So we've got a little bit of respite, if you like.
And in some sense, this is what they thought in New South Wales late last year too, and all of a sudden it's back on the agenda and headed for a vote in March. So you just never know what might happen, because they're fairly diligent, aren't they, in the group that is pushing for all of these sorts of reforms that ought to send a shudder into every Christian home when you think of Christian education being at risk in such a way that it is. But you've got Equality Australia. They're lobbying very hard, aren't they? And that would be happening in WA.
Yeah, look, I think that's happening right around the country, that the LGBTQ plus activists are quite active in lobbying, wanting to, impose their view of the world onto faith-based schools. And the interesting thing is that it's not just Christian schools, but the Muslim school movement is also very, very concerned about the implications of that. Like Muslim schools, for example, because they can't get enough Muslim teachers. At this point in time, they employ Christians and other people or people of no faith, but they have the requirement that a teacher must live a life that is consistent with their moral values. So, for example, a person can't be openly gay and teach in a Muslim school. They would not tolerate that, and so it's not just Christian schools that are affected; it's the Muslim schools and any school that really values or that holds to certain moral values and wants those values modelled by the staff. They are at risk of no longer being able to really be that community of faith that we've come to expect from faith-based schools.
So if the staff don't model the values, it does away with the value, doesn't it, of what Christian education might bring? Because while there might be a curriculum, and yes, you want to stay with that curriculum, but it's the person who teaches that curriculum and the values that they hold to, very, very important. Hey, Peter, what about vigilance here for those that you're serving in Western Australia and others listening around the nation? How do you be vigilant as a Christian parent, and when it comes to issues around schools and with the opposition that's coming and wanting to reform all of these values? What do you do to be vigilant?
Well, I think the important thing is to stay abreast of what's happening, and people can do that by, like the Christian school movement sends out emails to parents. Australian Christian Lobby, we keep people abreast of them. There's other groups too. Stay abreast of what's actually happening. But here in Western Australia, because the government has said they're not going to be doing anything this year, that effectively means not until after the next election, because our state election in Western Australia is in March next year. And so basically the end of this year, Parliament wraps up and then it goes into election mode. So it's going to be really important that we get clear statements from the political candidates and the political parties as to where they stand on this issue, because it really should be a deciding factor for Christians as to how they vote. And I suspect it will also be a very significant influence of how the Muslim community people would vote, because for people who value faith-based education, not to be allowed to give preference to people of your faith in employment at the school, and not being able to require staff to adhere to the values of your faith, that really becomes problematic.
Special honour to you, Peter Abetz, because what I've noticed over the years, and I'm sure your colleagues would agree with this, Peter Abetz is always on the front foot. You know, we talk about, being on the back foot. You're in defence mode. There's always a front foot initiative from the Peter Abetz that I very much enjoy talking to and getting an update on things that are developing in Western Australia. Hey, on front foot initiatives and things that are also brewing in WA, the conversion therapy legislation. What's the latest on what's happening there in Western Australia?
Look, we really don't quite know what's going on there, because the government did commit at the last election that they would introduce so-called ban on gay conversion, the legislation to ban that. And the LGBTQ plus activists are pretty irate, and they're lobbying pretty hard and using the media to remind the government of that commitment, because the government at this point hasn't actually moved to do anything in that space. Now, I requested to be involved in the stakeholder consultation process. Some of your listeners may not be aware, but the normal way that legislation is developed is that the minister responsible, he decides this is roughly the sort of direction we want legislation to go, but then they have stakeholder consultation where people who are going to be affected by the legislation are invited to provide comment or sit around the table and talk about what the impact might be and things perhaps to avoid, etc. And so I've requested to be noted as a stakeholder in the consultation process, and I was told that nothing is happening as yet, and that was very late last year. So I'm just not quite sure whether the government's actually going to get to do that still before this election. So it's my guess is that since Martin McGowan is no longer the Premier, the Labor Party's popularity has plummeted, and some of the public opinion polls suggest that the Liberals are actually within striking distance of possibly even winning government. So my guess would be that Labor would be very unwise to pick a fight with the faith communities in the year leading up to an election. My guess is they're going to try and hold off until after the next election, and if they win government, if Labor again wins government, they'll tackle it then. That would be my guess. But in politics, they say a week is a long time in politics, so you just simply don't know what's happening next.
And if there is a holding off, I imagine the Christian might think that is good news, but others might be saying, well, maybe holding off what might be inevitable. But this is the interesting thing that you just drew significant attention to. With Mark McGowan gone, there's a real weakness now in the Labor Party government in Western Australia, and you're saying that the Liberals are within striking distance. I think they've got a long way to go, haven't they? But this thought of picking a fight between the Christian faith community, and maybe include other faith communities in there as well, and the LGBT activists. There's a big support base on the Christian side, but perhaps not as much further in voting according to our Christian values. This is one of those things that's going to be very important, isn't it, for the Western Australian election, if this particular issue comes to the fore?
Look, it's really important that Christians really look at the policies or the stand that the different parties have on this issue of so-called gay conversion laws. Like if you look at, for example, the law that's been tabled in Tasmania, their conversion therapy law, that is so much more, dare I say, balanced than, say, the draconian Victorian legislation, because it allows for parents that, like, a parent talking to their child doesn't constitute attempts at conversion therapy and so on. And the Tasmanian legislation, for example, allows if a person asks you to pray for them, say that God would help them overcome their same-sex attraction. In Victoria, you can go to jail if you meet that request, whereas in Tasmania, according to their draft legislation, you wouldn't. So it really, it'll be very... my guess is that the government realises that they really need to work hard at trying to get reasonable legislation, and that's going to take a significant amount of time. And one of the other factors I think that's at play is that the government's got so much legislation in front of Parliament at the moment that if they were to introduce gay conversion therapy legislation, it would take up a massive amount of time, of debating time, which would prevent some of that other legislation getting through before the end of the year, when Parliament goes into, or is prorogued, in readiness for the election, because then everything falls off the table. So it really just depends on what the government's priorities are going to be.
And you've got other states, like you say, Victoria, and I think in the ACT, and there might be others as well, where Christian people are criminalised because they are praying for people who have an unwanted same-sex attraction. So those sorts of issues, they're at play, and in WA, those things appear to be off the table for the meantime. Hey, Peter, some of the other typical sorts of issues that Western Australian listeners might be interested in. You've been following along some of the stats for the hospital system in Western Australia. What does things look like there?
Look, our hospital system is under enormous pressure, and we've had a major problem with ambulance ramping, and so many ambulances tied up at hospitals that they can't get out to do emergency calls, call outs and so on. So that's a real issue. And according to some reports, apparently West Australia should have an extra 612 hospital beds to bring us up to the Australia's national average. Now, 612 beds, that's a big hospital. So it's a massive shortage of hospital beds. And basically what it really means is that there's just been a gross underinvestment in our hospital system for some time. I can remember when, was it 2008, I think it was, the outgoing at that time, the Labor government, they were going to close the Royal Perth Hospital, and they were building the new Fiona Stanley Hospital, which is a great hospital in the southern suburbs. And the reality was there just wouldn't be enough beds if they closed the Royal Perth. And the incoming Liberal government actually didn't close Royal Perth. And if it had been closed, our system would be in total disaster. So really what needs to happen is either each of the hospitals needs expansion, or they actually need to build a whole new hospital somewhere to give us sufficient hospital beds.
And mental health hospitals too. There's one there in Western Australia that's closed down, despite the fact that there's a huge need for mental health beds. What's happened there?
Yeah, look, unfortunately what's happened is I'm not sure, Bethesda, I think is how you pronounce it. It's a private, not-for-profit group. They built a $60 million facility in the southern suburb of Coburn, a 75-bed private mental health facility. And 9 months after opening it, they've announced they're closing it. There's a twofold reason. One is not being able to get sufficient psychiatrists willing to do the inpatient work, and that's a real problem. There's a massive shortage of psychiatrists in the country. But the other problem is that private health insurance rebates are insufficient to cover the true cost of inpatient mental health care. And so apparently most health funds only pay 85%, leaving the patient to pay the other 15%, which, when somebody's in hospital for a month, that amounts to thousands of dollars. And so these people are being pushed into the public mental health system, which is already grossly overstretched. So it's a real tragedy that this mental health facility in the southern suburbs is closing down. They are talking with government about what could be done to make sure it stays open, but it looks like at the end of this month, only a few weeks away, they're planning to shut it down at this point.
And another one that's a little bit amusing, I guess amusing if unless you're in the firing line here, but there was an interesting little story that came out of WA about a helicopter tanker fighting a bushfire. What was the story around that?
Yeah, the helicopters, they have the heli tankers, as they call them, they have a capacity to hover over a lake, and they drop this suction pipe, and they can suck water out of a dam and while they're hovering there, and fill their tank, and off they go and dump it on the fire. And they have a map which shows which any no-go zone, ponds or lakes they're not allowed to take water from. And apparently there was one that contained sewage water holding dam, and it wasn't marked as a no-go zone, and so some 75,000 litres of sewage water was used to put out a fire out near Bullsbrook, which caused a bit of consternation, as you could imagine, and the health department told people to empty their water tanks and to do a clean-up and all that, but it's not quite clear actually whether the water was dumped onto any houses or whether it was near the perimeter. But it's there's a humorous aspect to it, but for people who are directly involved, it would be quite concerning because you've got to do the clean-up and all of that. But I guess the bright side is that perhaps it might make the bush regrow a little quicker with that bit of fertiliser.
Yes, quicker regrowth, and, forget the birds flying over. Just don't look up if there's a helicopter overhead and those sorts of areas. Hey, great insights always. Just a fabulous update on what's happening in Western Australia. Peter Abetz, Western Australian State Director for the Australian Christian Lobby. And for listeners, you might want to keep up to date with being informed about the issues as they are developing, not only in WA but in every state and territory around Australia. You'll be able to find some good resource at acl.org.au. That's the website address for the Christian Lobby, acl.org.au. Peter Abetz, thanks so much for updating us once again today on 2020.
My pleasure to be with you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.